Hello and welcome to another virtual book launch with BirdLife South Africa and the Struik Nature Club, an affiliate of Penguin Random House Publishers. I'd like to thank Struik for partnering with BirdLife South Africa yet again to run tonight's virtual launch. I'm your host, Melissa Whitecross, and for those of you who don't know me, I am the regular host of BirdLife South Africa's Conservation Conversations webinars, which run every Tuesday at 7 o'clock South African time. By day, I also manage BirdLife South Africa's landscape conservation program, which is focused on the preservation of our most threatened birds and the ecosystems they rely on. Tonight, we're excited to have author and naturalist Doug Newman joining us to launch his new and improved edition of Southern Africa's LBJs Made Simple. And for those of you who have not figured it out yet, LBJs stands for those little brown jobs, possibly the group of birds that has frustrated the majority of bird watchers for eons. But hopefully after tonight's talk, and once you've had a chance to get your hands on a copy of Doug's excellent book, we will be able to start identifying these tricky little feathered friends. When you exit the webinar this evening, you will be directed to a site where you can order your own copy of the book if you are feeling inspired to tackle the identification quest that is South Africa's LBJs. The offer is a 20% off with free delivery within the borders of South Africa, and this offer ends on the 31st of July. So be sure to get your copy for a mere 208 Rand if you are having it delivered within South Africa. We'll also be awarding one lucky attendee based in South Africa a free copy of this book for asking the top question tonight. So make sure to get your questions in, and please remember that you can post your questions into the Q&A box in our Zoom room. And if you're listening on Facebook Live, please do pop those questions through in the comment feed. And Doug will answer these at the end of the webinar. Once we're through all of the questions, Doug will be deciding on tonight's winner, and we will contact you after the webinar to arrange delivery of your prize. Now tonight, it is wonderful to welcome our featured author, Doug Newman. Doug is an electrical engineer by trade and is an avid and active sound recordist with a keen interest in birds, particularly their calls. He is the author of Bird Calls for Beginners, More Bird Calls for Beginners, and 500 Common Bird Calls in Southern Africa. But Doug doesn't just record birds, he's also co-authored the Southern African Mammals Made Simple and is the co-founder of the Simply Birding website, which you can visit at www.simplybirding.com. Now, Doug, I have to say, having looked through the book ahead of this launch, I'm really impressed with the layout and the careful guidance that is provided in a succinct and clear way. Whenever people ask me, how do I get into birding and learn all of the 850 odd species we have here in South Africa, my first bit of advice is always to take the bird book and learn each of the bird families, like your doves, ducks, or your larks. Now, once you've done that, you can then dive into the right section of the bird book to start learning the finer details of each species within that family. I see in your fantastic book that this is step one, and it is very well described indeed. I know there are 2 more steps to come in your book, and we are going to let you take it away with your presentation explaining just how this 3-step process into the world of LBJs works. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, Doug, and over to you.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, the whole premise of the book really is about breaking LBJs down into a fairly simple process of identification to make it not so onerous a task and essentially being too daunting. So I'm going to go through what the whole LBJs Made Simple and bird identification philosophy is about and how we tackle ID. And hopefully not only in this book, the principles of bird identification that we use can actually be applied to any family, even if you're starting out simply with ducks and pigeons and so on. So yeah, effectively, just first off, thanks to BirdLife for hosting this virtual launch. I hope you guys will enjoy the content this evening. So essentially, the first question a lot of people ask when it comes to LBJs is, are they as difficult as it would seem? And to begin with, if you don't approach LBJ identification correctly, yes, it can be immensely confusing and very daunting. And part of the problem is that because they all look so similar, both at a species and a family level, not all of these birds fit nicely into a family, and it's not always that obvious. You also have problems where some species vary in appearance, so you have different races or subspecies, as they're also known, that may look different. And it sometimes can be a little bit daunting when you're confronted with a wealth of information on how to identify LBJs if it's not broken down into more manageable steps. And further to that, because they're a troublesome group, you often find generalizations are sometimes made in the identification process. And I'll have a look at examples of where these cause problems for identification and how we've attempted to tackle this. So essentially, you'll see on the cover of LBJs Made Simple is that it's an identification guide and not a field guide. And we make quite an important differentiation between the two. And the fundamental differences really are that, particularly in an ID guide, all the races are dealt with in detail if need be, particularly where they're visually different. Whereas in a field guide, they're not always treated as such, because you don't have the space in a 700-page book to get the geographical variations in. Also with an ID guide, because you're primarily focused on identification, it's very context-driven to make sure that when you mention a feature or a characteristic, it's clearly explained the context in which it is meant, and field guides sometimes fall short in this area as well. Also, if you look at the number of species and the size of the book, we have more space. We've got half a page per species, so you've got more page real estate, so to speak, to deal with the birds in a little bit more detail. And one of the things we've done in our book, and it's not specifically unique to ID guides, but probably in birding circles, unique to the way we've approached identification, is that everything is entity driven or entity modeled, and I'll explain how that works in the identification process. And the one very important thing we've tried to avoid is subjective terminology, and you can't always get away from it, but it is very problematic for beginners and people who don't have a lot of field experience when you use subjective terminology. So the problem with subjective terminology in particular is that you need previous experience in order to be able to use a subjective term. And this often, unfortunately, makes it difficult. And it does sometimes create an unrealistic expectation on birders. Essentially, terms like longer versus shorter, larger, smaller, fatter, thinner. It doesn't help if you don't have experience of the various birds in that category. And I'm going to play a short video of exactly what the problem is with subjective terminology.
You know, they do say the infanta's eyes are more beautiful than the famous stone of Galveston.
What?
The famous stone of Galveston, my lord.
And what's that exactly?
Well, it's a famous blue stone. And it comes from Galveston.
And what about it?
Well, my lord, the infanta's eyes are bluer than it for a start.
I see. And have you ever seen this stone?
No, not as such, my lord, but I know a couple of people who have, and they say it's very, very blue indeed.
And have these people seen the infanta's eyes?
No, I shouldn't think so, my lord.
And neither have you, presumably.
No, my lord.
So what you're telling me, Percy, is that something you have never seen is slightly less blue than something else you have never seen.
Yes, my lord.
Percy.
And that's the problem with subjective terminology. You know, if I tell you, for example, that I've got two friends, and I just tell you that one is taller than the other, and you've never met any of them, and the one walks into the room, and I ask you which one it is, unless you've seen both, you just won't simply be able to make an accurate call on identification. The next thing is context, and throughout our book, putting things in visual groups, we've taken great pains to make sure that everything's meant in context. And here's a classic example that fortunately has started to drop out of many of the field guides. But here we have two larks, and these specifically, the one on the left is a eastern clapper, and the one on the right is a Cape clapper or Gullis clapper from that area of Southern Africa. And the books, some of them used to say greyback and brownback. Now the greyback is fine. There are very few larks that have such a greyback, although there are some. But when you look at a pointer of brownback on eastern clapper lark, unless the context is explained that you mean only separating these two, brownback becomes a little bit confusing because almost every single lark has a brown back. So unless you explain the context in which you mean brown back, that can actually look slightly confusing and a little bit pointless when you look at the rest of the larks. The next thing as well is the importance of handling subspecies when they look quite different. And a good example is lazy cisticola. Now, in first edition, we simply put them in plain-backed cisticolas because that's where most of them belong. But there is another race of rattling cisticola, the one on the right, that if a birder was having a look at that, they would go to a different group, probably not the plain-back group, and not be able to make a successful identification. So where the races are visually different, you have to handle them differently. And then generalizations as well. One of the biggest problems is where generalizations are made around certain birds. And the famous one is calling a Levaillant cisticola a wetland cisticola. And I've witnessed firsthand birders incorrectly identifying a Levaillant cisticola as a Cape grass bird purely because it wasn't near a wetland. And anyone who knows the species well will know most of them are around wetlands. It's predominantly where you find them, but go up to the top of the hills at Suikerbosrand in the tall grassland and you'll find them up there as well. So one has to be careful with the groupings and characteristics you use to make sure they're consistent across a group of birds. So with all these challenges and problems, how do we actually go about identifying LBJs? And obviously, from our point of view, the way we've approached it with LBJs Made Simple is probably, in our view, the easiest way to go about it. And I'll go through the steps now. So, as I mentioned, this book is not just an ID guide, but it's a design for an identification philosophy. So we've tried to remove, as I've said, as many subjective terminologies as possible and only use features that can easily be used. Where subspecies look different, treat them differently, and if they need to be in different places in the book, in different visual groups, then that's where they belong. And the important thing is birding is very much a visual pastime, and yes, sound as well if you include call, but everything needs to be as visual as possible to make it something you can look at. So many years ago, I heard a theory that you need at least 3 features to identify a bird. So we took this and worked with it a bit and thought, well, why not come up with an actual rule? And we called it the 3-tick rule. And that rule simply states that your pointers must be unique within a group and that you have to match all 3 of those pointers to make a successful identification. But those pointers could include habitat, call, behavior, if need be, where there aren't only strictly simple visual features. So here's an example of our pointers in the book. If you look at the scrub robins, in terms of our 3-tick rule. So you've got your brown scrub robin, and there's 3 pointers there, white-browed scrub robin. There's a red pointer, which I'll get to in a minute. It's Kalahari scrub robin and Karoo scrub robin. Now, if you look at this very quickly, you can actually see that the brown scrub robin and the Kalahari scrub robin have pinkish brown legs. And the rest, you can split them out. So if it doesn't have pinkish brown legs, then already you've split your birds in half. Same with the rump color. Two of them have got a rich rufous rump. One's got a brown rump and the other one's got a gray-brown rump. So already with one visual feature, you've already removed half of the birds from your shortlist of what you're looking at. And particular, obviously, sometimes in a group, there may be one feature that is very distinctive amongst everything in the group. And in that case, a simple red pointer means if you see that feature that's marked in red, that alone is enough to make an identification. So if you're still daunted by LBJs, don't panic. So I'm going to go through looking at an LBJ, how you would use something like LBJs Made Simple to simplify your identification. So as mentioned, it's broken down into 3 steps. Every step is visual. Every step has summaries. And the important thing is, yes, you can't actually identify a lark with only 3 features. But if you put all the pointers together between separating the families, separating the visual groups, and identifying a species, you may have 10, 12 or more features that make a rufous-naped lark a rufous-naped lark. But to put all those features on the plate as pointers, the bird will end up looking like a pincushion, and the identification process would be very, very daunting. So the first thing, and Melissa had mentioned it in the beginning, that she mentions to bird is learn your families. And obviously LBJ families can be a little bit trickier. So right in the beginning of the book, we go through each family and what constitutes a cisticola, a warbler, a pipit, a lark, whatever the case may be. And the most important thing, and we reiterate this throughout the book, is there's an at-a-glance block. So that gives you simple bullet points, the list of what makes a cisticola a cisticola. And then we mention similar looking families. So even if you think you're dealing with a cisticola, it just reminds you that actually there are other families you need to consider just to make sure that you end up in the right family. So now you've dealt with your bird, and you'll see as well, particularly with the separating the families, we've used a silhouette. And the reason we did this is within a family, visually the birds may look different. So we felt if we put a picture of the bird, an illustration, it may create the impression that all the birds in the family look like that. Whereas this helps reiterate that general impression of size and shape, which is very important for birders to get a grips with. So here you can get a simple sense of the shape of what the bird looks like. And again, wherever we have physical features, we point to it so you know exactly where you need to look. And here's a closer look at the at-a-glance block. So we really make it simple for you to hone in on what family you're dealing with. And particularly where there may be subtle nuances where a bird in the family might behave a little bit differently to the members of the family, we add a note at the bottom. And in this case for cisticolas, they don't cock their tails like prinias do. However, lazy cisticola is a cisticola that does that. So it just brings that to mind that if you see a lazy cisticola, just bear in mind that it may not be a prinia. So one of the other advantages of separating the families is it helps you to get to know your families well and what the features are. And even if you get to the point where a lot of your LBJ identification you're doing on your own without using a book like LBJs Made Simple, you can double check yourself if you're not quite sure and just check and say, okay, I think I'm dealing with a flycatcher. And an example of this, someone posted a picture of a Morocco flycatcher, and well, they said that they thought it was a brown-backed honeybird. And obviously, having put this book together, it immediately was obvious that this bird didn't have the zygodactyl feet with the 2 toes forward and 2 back. So immediately I pointed out just saying, just look at the feet. I don't think you're dealing with a honey guide. So it does help you just double check if you think you've made a correct identification, to just double check that you are in the correct family. And over time, that just helps build more confidence in your own birding ID skills as you get to know your families better. And that's the groundwork for all bird identification. So you've now decided that you're dealing with a cisticola or a lark or a warbler, and it'll take you to separating the visual groups. So the first thing we do is we give a little bit more of a detailed write-up about each of the families and some information about how they behave, how they sound, where you might find them, whatever things are relevant to identification. And again, and there's lots of these little lists and helpful things throughout the book, you'll see a nice little look for box. And that look for box breaks down for a warbler what you need to know, or for a cisticola. And where this is helpful is a bird may not stick around very long. So if you see what you think is a warbler, this tells you very quickly from all the information what you should gather quickly to hopefully make an identification. And if you're looking at your bird in question and you gather this information here in this list, you should be able to make an identification even if the bird has now flown off. So it really helps you get to the right information you need to know fast to make your identification simple. So now with the separating the visual groups, we now break each family down into groups based on visual features. And again, we've stuck with silhouettes just to make sure that we're not making visual confusing statements. And we pointed everything that you need to know. So if you pick your warbler and you have a look at the features, you decide it fits in a particular visual group, and then you will turn to the plates. So already at this point, I think the largest group in the whole book is about 9 birds. And we try and keep each visual group smaller than that if possible. So already having done just those 2 steps out of the sea of however many LBJ species you're considering, you've already narrowed down your possible birds for your identification to a handful of species, single digits, a number of species already. So now you start matching your species, and we're going to look closely at the actual plate page. So what we did first off was we came up with this 2-column layout. And the reason for that is I tended to find myself that moving between the plate page and the text page in a field guide side to side, I sometimes got lost and confused as to which picture I was looking at versus the text I was reading. So it's far simpler to have the text and the bird intertwined and interwoven so that you're not flipping from page to page and possibly getting lost and looking at the wrong picture and then not realizing or understanding why the text you're reading doesn't match the picture you're looking at, only to realize you're looking at the wrong picture. So this really makes it simple to keep all the stuff together with each species. So now we home in on here's a Barrett's warbler, and you simply match all of these pointers. And again, as we said, they point at what is needed. So if I refer to a mantle, I say that the mantle's paler than the nape. If you're really new to birding and you haven't learned all your anatomy and physiology of the bird yet, and you don't know what a mantle means, doesn't really matter because we pointed it. So you just look at where we're pointing. And if there's a red pointer, you match that, or you match all 3 orange pointers. Now you'll notice on this particular bird, there's only 2 orange pointers, but you have to have 3 features. And in this particular case, habitat is orange. So wherever text is relevant, so habitat, call, whatever the case may be, we've colored that text a color to draw attention to it, that as you're reading through it, you know that's what you need to look at. Aside from that, all the text in black, you don't even have to bother to read it in the field to make an identification. That's nice to know additional information, but it's really not needed in the field. And then finally, on every page with every species, there's a barcode using the Struik Nature app. The first book that Struik Nature released that used this was the new Sasol Birds of Southern Africa. So we're using the same app and the same technology, although we're using different calls. And you scan the barcode, and in some cases, you'll get a comparative track. Now at the bottom of the plate page, again, we've got lists and boxes and at-a-glances everywhere. So for Barrett's Warbler, there's a simple box that tells you absolutely everything you need to know in that group that makes a Barrett's Warbler a Barrett's Warbler. And essentially, we have similar looking at the bottom. So we tell you other species you might be confusing it with. On the similar sounding, we mention what birds sound similar. And as much as possible, we add notes to further reinforce identification. And all these notes have been built up over the years. There'll be discussions on Facebook and before Facebook on various forums and SA BirdNet when that email forum was going, and discussions back and forth. And someone would say, well, ultimately, this is how you identify how I split these two species. And over the years, just collected that wealth of local knowledge of how people in the field separate, difficult to separate birds. And I mentioned the comparative tracks. So one of the most important things with birding, and particularly LBJs, is there is a need for you from time to time to use bird calls, because there are times when some of them visually are quite similar and call is going to be needed. And particularly if you have not spent a lot of time learning your bird calls and learned how to listen to them closely to pick out the finer details, can be a bit daunting. So we have narrated comparative tracks that tell you exactly what you're listening for, and even play the calls at half speed so that you can hear the subtle details.
Separating wing snapping, cloud and desert cisticulars and nediki on call involves listening to pitch, note inflections and tone. Wing snapping cisticular has a distinctive I'm airs, airs, airs call, with the important characteristic being the inflection on the airs note. Listen first to a single phrase at half speed. Then at full speed. And finally to the full call, which includes wing snaps or clicks. Desert cisticular's call comprises a repeated series of high-pitched notes on the same frequency. Note that they sound identical to the high-pitched repetitive notes of nediki. Listen first at half speed. And now at full speed. Desert cisticular also gives a series of clicking notes. Although not wing clicks, these sound very similar to the clicks made by wing snapping cisticular and should not be used as a feature on their own for identification. Here is a full recording of desert cisticular's call, including the clicking sounds. Now listen to a comparative clip of wing snapping cisticular. Cloud cisticular's call has a three-pitched phrase. The low-pitched introductory note is followed by 3 or 4 mid-pitched notes and then by 2 or 3 high-pitched notes. The call concludes with several rapid chirps. Although the mid-pitched notes may seem to be reminiscent of wing-snapping cisticola, they lack the air's inflection. Here is cloud cisticula's call, first at half speed, and now at full speed. Nediki has a repetitive, high-pitched call that is almost identical to that of desert cisticola, and care should be taken when separating the two species on this call alone. However, Nediki also has a more common call that comprises repeated staccato chirps, similar to the clicks of desert cisticola, but the call is much fuller and persists for longer.
So that gives you an idea of how we build our comparative tracks, and there's a lot of them littered throughout the book, separating a range of species on call. Now, I mentioned earlier that subspecies are handled differently compared to any other identification guide in the region. So a classic example is rattling cisticola, and that has 17 subspecies in our region alone, some of which look fundamentally visually different. So if you have a look here, here's rattling cisticola, and surprisingly, we have it in the plainback group. And that is because the specific Procerus race in Mozambique, in breeding plumage, has an almost plain back. And anyone who looks at it is not going to call it a marked back cisticola. So it had to be in the plain back group. However, we then go further, and we've now got, in the long tail bold markings on brown back group, we've got rattling cisticola again. And here we mention all except Fratter and the Procerus breeding range. So the vast majority of rattling cisticolas fit in this group. What you will notice if you look closely is you look at the map for rattling cisticola on the left there. It's only the map for where you find that race. We've split the maps out so that when you're dealing with that race, you're not going to be looking in the wrong area of the country. Now you'll see this rattling cisticola map here doesn't have that piece up in Mozambique because it doesn't include that distribution. And finally, you have one particular race of rattling cisticola in Namibia, which has a grey back versus a brown back, and we've put that in the grey back with markings group. So rattling cisticola appears in 3 different places because it has 3 different visual representations that would normally, if you tried to lump them under one set of pointers, would probably leave you confused, particularly if you found yourself in breeding season in Mozambique. So we've essentially really split them out visually to avoid any confusion. That having been said, it all sounds in principle like fairly simple. And is there more to LBJ identification than just that? And of course there is. So essentially, if you look at the first edition, anyone who's already got the book, is there a reason to go to second edition? With many of my field guides, I don't always buy every new edition that comes out. I may skip an edition or 2. So for those who have the book, what is different between this one and the last edition? So there are a number of places where we've added additional identification information. So in first edition, we simply said the African and Eurasian reed warblers, for the vast majority of birders, are inseparable in the field. You're not going to be able to use wing formula, but we felt we needed to have something. So we included the wing formulas for the difficult to identify warblers in this book. So at least there is some identifying features if you were in the right scenario to be able to use wing formulas. For the aerial displaying cisticulars, zitting, cloud, desert, pale crowned, etc., their display flights follow very specific paths. So we've illustrated what those look like, and some of them fly much higher off the ground, some of them lower, and they take quite distinct paths. So we've illustrated those so you can see what that display path looks like. For some of the cisticulars which are quite habitat bound, there is quite useful habitat and distribution pointers, and particularly in that group, across the whole visual group, habitat and distribution are 2 pointers across all those cisticulars. So we thought what would be nice at the end of that particular group is have a simple 1-column habitat and distribution quick reference lookup for the cisticulars in that group. So that makes that particular group a little bit easier to identify quickly in the field. Then for the troublesome group within the larks of rufous-naped, flappet, and clapper lark, we've done a nice double-page spread giving you more information about how to separate those particularly troublesome 3 lark species. We've also tried to add a bit more space and include even more habitat photos, and obviously habitat's quite important, and we have made use of habitat throughout the book. So it does help if we're telling you that a bird is found in a particular habitat to have some sort of visual reference of what that habitat looks like. And in terms of additional stuff that is not in first edition, so we've included the new species for the region that are LBJs, so that's Upsher's warbler and rufous-tailed scrub robin, are treated properly in the LBJ model. We felt in hindsight we dealt with the LBJ weavers, so to speak, the non-breedings, but we thought we might as well, seeing as we're doing a new edition, add in the 2 golden weavers just to close out the weaver identification. And we've removed species that are no longer considered species, so that would be the Kimberley and the long-tailed pipits. And in chatting to birders who've used our book, we got some feedback where people thought it worked really well, and some people said that they found certain things didn't quite work. So we've made improvements to the ID model, better treatment of subspecies, and the subspecies specific maps. And above all, in the first edition, there were quite a few calls missing. Now, the only call that we don't have currently with this book is Stark's lark, but every single bird has a call. But more importantly, if you have the book and you have the new Struik Nature Sounds app, we're using our Simply Birding Nature Sounds calls, and you'll notice we've re-recorded and remastered all of them, and the quality is really as high quality call as possible. And I don't think you will find better quality calls than what we've bundled with this book. They're really clear. There's no background species of any other sort, so you're not confused as to which bird, if there's 2 or 3 calling on the clip you're supposed to be listening to. You're only hearing the bird call that is in question. So other reasons that I would like to think this book is a must-have for any birder's library. It's the only fully updated LBJ guide currently that covers all of the new species, including Upsher's and Upsher's warbler and rufous-tailed scrub robin. It's the only LBJ guide that has accompanying calls, and also we're the only book in the region, other than obviously the other one I published, 500 Common Bird Calls, to list similar sounding, and the only book that has comparative tracks. And this really does help you to learn the skill of birding by ear. And above all, when we tested the first book out, we took a couple of complete novices out and said, okay, let's test how easy it is for someone who's virtually never picked up binoculars before and pointed them at a bird to make an identification. And we said, here's the book, there's an LBJ, here's some binoculars, see what you can do. And they were making correct identifications on pipits, which are particularly troublesome birds, in under 2 minutes, and they'd hardly ever actually birded much at all before. So it's certainly something we're quite proud of, the fact that it does seem to really speed up and simplify the LBJ identification process. And seriously, I was birding at Mari Vale, and someone came up to us, and whether it was part tongue-in-cheek or not, I don't know, but she said, "Thanks for changing my life." She said the bird book really helped her with her LBJ identification. So yes, that's for us how you tackle LBJ identification. But more than that, the three-step philosophy, you can use it across all of your birding. So if I'm sitting scrolling through Facebook and I see something and someone asks, "What bird is this?" you can adopt the same approach to anything, whether you're helping someone else or identifying your own bird. You can go, "Okay, let me pick a feature I can see in the photo. Okay, I'm dealing with woodpeckers. This one's got no red on the forehead. So I can now remove all the woodpeckers that have red on the forehead. Okay, I'm down to 4 birds. Now I have a look at another feature, maybe a moustachial stripe or something like that, and you pick the birds that do or don't have that, and you narrow it further. And it's just a case of slowly isolating birds from your shortlist until you're down to 2 or 3 birds. Then you delve into your books more seriously and make a final identification, knowing that you only have to deal with separating bird A from bird B, because through your process of deduction and elimination, you've removed every other bird from your shortlist. And that's really the process and the philosophy that we've adopted with LBJs Made Simple. And that's it. I see there's some posts in Q&A, so I'm sure Melissa's going to share some questions with us now, and I'll answer those as best I can.
Absolutely. Doug, thank you so much. That was absolutely fantastic. And I really am just so impressed with what you guys have managed to achieve with this book. It is so elegantly simple and yet so full of information. And I think it's really a great introduction to these really tricky LBJs, and your 3-step guide and all of the habitat information that you give is just fantastic. So a huge congrats to you and Gordon and the Struik team, and well done. As an ecologist, I'm always drumming on with people, learn your habitats, understand these places that birds come in. I love that you've highlighted habitats as some of the key things to look at. I think a lot of birders arrive at habitat very late in their career. So it's wonderful to see that you're really pushing that habitat aspect. And I think LBJs is a fantastic way to really get into that.
Yes, thanks.
Obviously, habitats are quite complex. How did you go about sort of selecting a sort of example shot for your habitats for these birds?
Yeah, so really it was a case of, I mean, we tend to know our habitats reasonably well. You know, I've been birding for probably approaching 30 years. So, you know, when I want a habitat shot for a thrush nightingale, you know, I've seen them a couple of times up at Khomo. I know what they look like. I know where their habitats are, and specifically, I know what the habitats look like. So it's a case of trying to find a photo that represents that. And particularly when we did the first edition, we did a whole western half of the country trip and specifically made sure we took pictures where we found specific species. So the red lark, the habitat photo we have in the book, was taken specifically at that spot we went to intentionally look for red lark. So a lot of the habitat photos were taken intentionally for specific species as well.
Fantastic. And yeah, it's great that you've got that nice comparison between the illustrations and those photographs. I find sometimes illustrations can be a little bit tricky to kind of bring into reality. So it's nice to have that double comparison.
Yes, and we felt both, because initially we were kind of torn with, do we just go with photographs because they give you the best sense of that general impression of size and shape, but you're never going to get every species in the pose that you want in the right photograph to be able to point at features. So we really felt both would do the topic of LBJs the best justice, because we could ensure the illustration showed what we want, but then we could have the photo really giving you a true sense of the shape and in habitat and in context what the bird looks like.
Absolutely. Now we're going to dive into some of these questions, Doug. So the first one is from Lindsay, and she is asking, we've seen a lot of debate, particularly as we've gone through lockdown, around birding ethics and the use of playback and that sort of thing. Now you've created this wonderful resource for people to learn their calls, but she'd like to know, how does one go about dealing with these skulky birds that obviously can be quite challenging to get them to present themselves in a way that you can actually see them? I'm thinking along the lines of, say, a Barrett's warbler, which often hides itself inside a dense thicket. There's obviously ethical implications for playing a call, but do you have any tips in terms of being patient with these skulkers and getting a good visual of them without sort of overusing the playback that one can?
Yeah, so ideally your first prize is to read up on the behavior, because that will give you the best sense of how you might go about actually finding the bird you're looking for. The next thing is obviously avoid playback at all cost. And if you really have to use playback, the golden rule is the moment the bird has responded, stop. Because there's a twofold problem here. The first is that ultimately the birds may get so intimidated that they eventually leave. And there's a famous spot in Wakkerstroom where people used to regularly go for bush blackcap, and they abandoned the site and the bush blackcap is no longer there because they were literally, the term was taped to death, and they literally just fled. And the problem is, when birds are breeding, that call represents a threat to the breeding pair, and the male will do his best to chase the threat away. And that helps you superficially, that you get this lovely response. Maybe the bird might even dive bomb you or fly over your head, and that's wonderful. But if you persist, ultimately what will happen is, firstly, it takes a massive amount of energy for birds to call and aggressively defend their territory. So you're already taxing their resources, but worse than that, if every day another bird is coming along and disturbing those birds, and as far as the female is concerned, that male's unable to chase off the threat in that territory, that may actually end up splitting up that pair and disrupting the breeding of those birds. So it can be immensely damaging and very, very disruptive.
Absolutely. And I think we're only now really seeing just how disruptive a lot of playback can be. And I agree with you. There's so many spots where people used to go and use pearl-spotted owl and all sorts of things. Famously, nails flay, pearl-spotted owl no longer works on getting birds roused because it has been taped to death in that area. So definitely always, and BirdLife South Africa has been advocating for this a lot, be ethical in the way you use tape playback. Short bursts, and definitely not during the breeding season. It has a huge impact. And I think you've given a fantastic overview there, Doug. So thank you for that. Onto something slightly lighter. This one's from Rosemarie, and she'd like to know, which LBJ is your favorite and most exciting, and why?
Sure. Actually, that's a very difficult question to answer. And the reason I say that is because, so obviously I keep my life list, but whenever I go out on a trip, like most birders, I do a trip list. So kind of everything's special. And then you get to a point where you go, well, I'm on 120 for the weekend and I haven't even seen a hoddy-daw, which is ridiculous. And now you're running around looking for a hoddy-daw because you should have one. And then you get excited when you find one because it was the quest for your day, because you didn't have something so obvious. Yeah, it really is a tricky one. But I'd probably say, if anything, because of my interest in vocalization, probably I would lean towards short-clawed lark. And the reason I say that is there's an interesting phenomenon in birds where they have independent nerves to each half of their syrinx. So they can make independent sounds at the same time. Effectively, some birds can harmonize with themselves.
Wow.
And the actual recording on this this app for this book. It sounds like there's two short-clawed larks calling at once, but it wasn't. It was one bird, and it's a very interesting and obvious example of dual use of the syrinx, which is quite fascinating.
Sure, that is unbelievable. I had no idea that they could do that, so that is truly fascinating. Speaking of all of these incredible recordings, Doug, I know we're seeing a massive burst in the sort of acoustics community, and many more people who maybe aren't going into birding for the photography are actually getting into their sound recording and starting to record all of these audio calls that are out there. And sites like Xenocanto are booming with citizen scientists uploading all of their calls. What tips would you give any beginner acoustics nut that would like to get into recording bird calls? How would you suggest they go about doing so?
So obviously, if you want to get a good end result, like anything, you can't go and buy the cheapest entry-level camera and expect to compete with people who are publishing bird photographs. You need high-end camera equipment, and the same goes for recording. But that doesn't mean, like someone who with a simple point-and-shoot camera takes acceptable bird photographs, that you can't record. And the simplest is you can record with your cell phone. And a lot of people are getting fairly acceptable results just doing either a voice note, or particularly on a number of Facebook groups that are aimed at helping people with call identification, just shooting a video. So that's the simplest way to get started. And then you can move up from there to getting a cheap little under R1,000 directional mic that plugs into your cell phone. And you can start moving up from there to more high-end equipment if you do actually start to take it really seriously. But honestly, record with your cell phone, get a shotgun mic that plugs into your cell phone if you want to take the next level up. And you can honestly take bird call recording fairly seriously without having to spend tens of thousands of rands.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Doug. And I'd really encourage everybody to get out there and do a bit of audio work. It is a whole new experience to birding and using that sound wave to get into your birds. I see we've got a question here from Marty. And Marty's asking, how far are we from a sound hound equivalent, which you can use in the field that helps to identify the bird calls using your mobile device, and then potentially links you to a field guide? So I know there's the Merlin app in the States, I believe. They're starting to record calls that you hear in the field and give you some kind of ID. Are we anywhere near there in terms of our South African bird acoustics?
So in short, I don't know if and when an app like that would come out for Southern Africa. And the reason I say that is probably because we are a bit behind the development curve. We've learned from the problems that the other applications have. So at most, they tend to be between 40 and 50% accurate. And the problem is your cell phone doesn't have a very good microphone, nor is it directional. So you end up trying to record this bird, and either there's a lot of noise, or worse, you've got 3 or 4 birds all calling at once at a similar level, and the app is just confused. So the reality is it will work brilliantly if you attach it to a very expensive shotgun mic with a good amplifier. Then the technology is brilliant. But to put it in a cell phone in someone's pocket, the way a cell phone microphone works, you're never going to get 80, 90, 95% accuracy on how it identifies the bird. So probably in hindsight, developers here haven't gone down that route because they know that ultimately the users of the app are only going to get at best a 1 in 2 success rate.
Sure. Thanks for that interesting insight. We've got a question here from Tanya, and she's wanting to talk around breeding LBJs and whether males get some sort of color when the breeding season starts. So obvious examples would be your bishops and that sort of thing. But what are the more subtle differences in, say, the cisticulars, and how does one navigate those changes from season to season?
Yeah, so cisticulars, they do have breeding and non-breeding plumages, but they're very subtly different. And more what it's about, if you take Levalent cisticular, the reason that we have it in 2 groups, we have black markings on we have black markings on the back, and then we have black back. And it's a subtle, it's almost like, does a zebra have black stripes on white or white stripes on black? When the feathers are fresh, the white edges or the pale edges on the feathers are broad and the back looks much paler. As those wear off, because the lighter part of the feather doesn't have as much keratin and it wears quicker, what happens is the back becomes blacker. So the birds do change appearance as the feathers wear. And also with bleaching, what you'll have is some of the warblers in the beginning of the season, when they've got fresh feathers, they're nice, richer brown, and they become a more sort of dull, a dull brown as the feathers are bleached by the sun. So there are changes to those effects, but they are more subtle.
Certainly, and it helps having a good camera to try and pick those up, because trying to ID that through your binoculars with a hip-hopping testicular or a displaying one is definitely going to be a challenge.
Yes.
Awesome. Following on from that, this one's from Janet Bloom. She'd like to know, in your opinion, which LBJ birders are most likely to confuse or misdiagnose?
I would say probably your warblers, because in reality, testiculars are not as difficult as they would appear, particularly when you tie the calls in, but they are quite visually distinctive. The honey guards, the sparrows, yeah, maybe pipits, but again, they split into quite nice, simple, small groups. The ones with the bold markings on the back, the plain-backed testiculars of plain-backed and buffy and so on. So even those aren't as tricky, but the warblers, you end up with large groups of very, very, very similar looking birds. And in a lot of cases, we've simply said for the vast majority of birders, learn your warbler calls. But even that, they're quite fast, and you've got to practice and get the nuances of pitch, tone, and that sort of thing. So I'd say the warblers are probably your trickiest group of all of them.
Absolutely, and I think you make such a good point there. There is no substitute for time in the field, and just spending as much time as you can with these birds, watching them, learning how they move in their habitats, where they are. It makes such a difference for getting a handle on these different LBJs.
Yes.
And I definitely say going out with people who know their LBJs and can sort of help point out some of those key features that you've highlighted so eloquently in your book. I think spending time with people who really understand these LBJs can really help uplift your own LBJ game. So going out with those experienced birders and bird clubs and asking those questions online, as you say, on the various Facebook platforms, all go hand in hand to making you a stronger LBJ birder.
Yeah.
We got a question here from Dr. Grabane, and they say, burning question, is it testicular or cysticola?
I would say whatever you're comfortable with. There's Gordon and I, my co-author, we were laughing quite hysterically when we were putting the first edition together. The narrator had said Levalin testicular, and obviously not being a birder, we went back and said it's got a slightly more French sound, and that's how you pronounce it, because he'd never pronounced these words before. So he sent us through about 6 or 7 pronunciations of Levalin testicular, and 2 or 3 of them were fine and about what we needed, but there were 2 or 3 really heavily should I say heavily pronounced or sort of French accented pronunciations of Levaillant, and it was quite hysterical to hear his excessive French attempt to pronounce, because he didn't know what it was supposed to sound like. So yes, the vast majority of birders I speak to call them testiculars, but I don't think there's a right or wrong way to pronounce it.
Yeah, definitely potato. I remember taking out Professor Ian Glen from UCT a couple of years ago, and he was busy writing his incredible novel on the life and history of Francois Levaillant. And we saw a Levaillant's cuckoo fly past, and of course I said, Levaillant's cuckoo, and he turned around and said in absolute horror, it is not Levaillant's, it's Levaillant. So I suppose it really does go with them. whoever you're with and their sort of subtleties of pronunciation. But yeah, I'm with you.
Yes.
Cisticola, cisticola, whatever works for you. That's the most important thing.
Yeah.
We got a question here from Eleanor Mary, and she's asking, are calls different in different seasons? And can one distinguish between breeding calls and alarm calls?
Yes, hugely. I mean, for all the LBJs, song's quite important. So they tend to have fairly distinctive calls, or should I say songs. The alarm calls tend to be much shorter and harsher. And yes, the calls, they tend to stop in the breeding, in the non-breeding season. And I could go on for another whole hour about how the calls change, and there's actually hormonal differences that cause parts of the song control centers of the brain to actually change in size during the non-breeding season. And there's actually some thought that birds actually lose some of their ability physically to actually sing in winter.
Jeez, that is absolutely incredible. Wow. I think I'm going to have to get you onto Conservation Conversations to come talk about bird call dynamics and physiology. That would be fascinating. We've got another question here also around the calls. Ivan Anderson is asking, do the LBJs mimic others? And are there specific LBJs where sounds are therefore not useful? So I think particularly here your warbler species, which are notorious for mimicking other species. How do you start breaking down those mimics calls to get an ID?
Yeah, so what tends to happen is most birds that mimic tend to mimic a piece and then move on to something else. So quite often, if the call keeps changing, already you know you're dealing with a mimic versus the real thing. But yeah, we've only used call as an important part for identification when there wasn't a visual way to do it. So throughout this whole book, you only really have to rely on call when there's no other option for the vast majority of birders who don't have in-depth LBJ field experience. So we have relied on call only when they're distinctive enough that you're going to be able to use it definitively.
Fantastic. Thanks, Doug. And I see we're getting a lot of love for the Conservation Conversations ideas. So I hope you got some space in your calendar a bit later in this year to come chat to our
definitely.
audience.
Yeah.
Fantastic. We look forward to that. All right. I see it has gone over 8 o'clock. So I'm going to give one more question, Doug, and I'll then let you decide who you think should take the prize home. But this one is from Eleanor Peak, and she is asking, how long has it taken you to produce this incredible book?
So interestingly enough, to research and put the first book together, the first edition, was 7 years of research. So we equated that if we did Southern African birds made simple, if we ever could, we were looking at 25 to 30 years of research to do it enough justice to do it properly.
Wow, that is incredible. And this updated edition, how long has that taken?
Yeah, that was probably about 6 months because it was a lot simpler. We just took the families we weren't happy with how the model worked, remodeled them, added in a couple of species, took a few things out, and then just re-looked at the layout. Because the other thing that I didn't mention is the double-page spreads in this whole book are carefully thought out. They don't follow a taxonomic order. If there are 4 birds that are similar visually, they're on a double-page spread. So you go to that page, and all 4 birds that you're going to consider are in one place side by side.
Amazing. It's great to see just how much thought has gone into the production of this book, and a huge kudos to you, Gordon, and the Struik team. I'm blown away by how brilliant this book is. I used your first edition extensively in my birding years, and I'm really chuffed with this new edition, and I can't wait to start playing around with it again and reliving all those LBJ ID moments.
Brilliant.
Doug, I'm not sure if you have an answer for us in terms of our winning question this evening.
Yes, I do. I mean, there were some really, really good questions across the board, but I particularly, because it's something I do feel quite strongly about myself, I think for having raised the topic, I think Lindsay's question about call playback
Fantastic.
that struck a note with me the most of all, I would think.
Wonderful, Doug. I fully agree with you. And Lindy Christensen, thank you so much for sending that question through. We will get in touch with you tomorrow to arrange delivery of your prize. Doug, with that, a big thank you to you, as well as Belinda, who is in the audience. Thank you so much for setting this up. Belinda is from the Struik Nature team and has been amazing at assisting us in putting this virtual launch together. So from all of us at BirdLife South Africa, as well as the Struik Nature Club, a huge thank you to all of you for spending your Wednesday night with us and learning all things LBJs. Doug, I don't know if you've got any closing sentiments before we close down for tonight.
No, just again, thanks for the time and the opportunity to speak to some of your members. And yeah, I hope you guys get value out of the work that we've done, and hopefully you'll find it a bit easier to identify LBJs.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Doug. Good night to all of you. Thank you so much for joining us. Keep safe, and I hope that you get out there and enjoy those LBJs as soon as you can with your latest copy of the LBJs Made Simple. Good night, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us.